Welcome to Life Lessons in Law with Lashonda. I'm your host, Lashonda Counsel Rogers. In each episode, we have authentic and entertaining conversations about the impact of the law on women. You can find this show on my website, www.thecounselfirm.com, and on YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and more. Now, please join me in Life Lessons in Law with Lashonda. Hello, everyone, and welcome to yet another episode of Life Lessons in Law with Lashonda. Today, we have another magnificent, great, spectacular, all those words, whatever you want to use, guest, Whitney Knox Lee. Hi, Whitney. How are you?
Hey, I'm so good. I'm so excited for this because, we've talked about this before and it's nice that it's happening.
Yes, definitely. Now, everyone, Whitney is a civil rights attorney here in Georgia. And I know a lot of people may not know, and I always like to jump in, what a civil rights attorney does and what civil rights encompasses. So, Whitney, I guess give us a broad overview and narrow us down into specifically what you do as a civil rights attorney.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right that civil rights work is very broad and lawyering itself is very broad. I'm sure you've had these times where folks come up to you and they say, you're a lawyer. They ask if you're a lawyer and you're like, yes. And then it's like, okay, but then they launch into some issue that you have no idea about.
Oh, yeah. Wait, before you move off of that, yes, this is a public service announcement to everyone who may or may not know, but no, if you know, you shouldn't do this. Okay, a lawyer generally specializes in maybe one, two, maybe three areas. So, although Whitney and I wear the lawyer hat, that does not mean jack of all trades law. So, all my wonderful family members that I love so much, just because we say we're lawyers doesn't mean we know it all. We do not. We try our best. We like to think we know it all, but we do not.
We don't.
And I digress. Okay, back to you, Whitney.
Yeah, don't trust that. Red flag if you pull up to somebody's office and it's like, I do all the things. No, don't do that.
Yeah, I do all law. You cannot. You
Mm-mm.
cannot.
No. So, okay. Civil rights law, though, is essentially the practice anytime an attorney is representing someone or a group of people to uphold their constitutional rights, is what I really consider civil rights law. And so, what I do specifically is around ensuring that folks who are incarcerated in jails and prisons are being treated like people, like
Mhm.
actual humans, and that their basic civil rights and constitutional rights are being followed. So that means things like getting adequate medical care, getting meals at the prison, um, getting, I don't know, protection from harm. So if there are safety concerns, we'll get involved there. There's many different types. I mean, we've got disability attorneys who focus on civil rights for people who are living with disabilities. There are folks who do policing, as I'm sure a lot of folks, that's kind of what's big in the news right now,
Mhm.
is because of all of the violence, the state-sanctioned violence against Black and brown people by police officers. So that is also civil rights work where you somebody is representing a family of somebody who's been harmed by police or that person themselves who's been harmed by police. That's also civil rights work. Historically, it's come up a lot, and when we're learning about civil rights in school, we're learning about right to vote
Mhm.
or right to, I don't be considered a person, as far as Black folks are concerned, as far as minorities are concerned. Um, and so civil rights really encompasses all sorts of stuff. And people do have specialties within civil rights. And like I said, what I do specifically is around ensuring that people in jails and prisons are being treated like people.
Wow, that is very important work because I think oftentimes people think, or those who are in charge of ensuring the safety of those who are incarcerated think that because a crime has been committed, or a potentially a crime has been committed, because some of the people who are in custody, they haven't had a trial, they haven't been proven guilty at all. But the fact that they have found themselves in that position, some people feel like, oh well, we don't need to make sure you have proper care, or the proper care is not given, as if they are less than because of this situation. And like we're saying, some people aren't guilty, and even if they are guilty, they are still human, and they're subject, and they have the right to have basic medical care.
That's
Like
right.
you said, food, not to be eaten alive by bed bugs.
Exactly.
Oh, yes.
Exactly. Yeah.
And go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say that Georgia incarcerates the greatest percentage of our population than any other state in the United States, which means most people in Georgia are affected by incarceration, whether they themselves have been incarcerated or they have loved ones who have been incarcerated, being employed by Georgia Department of Corrections or a local county jail or law enforcement agency. This, system in Georgia is a huge, huge, complex system. And as you said, Lashonda, I mean, even if we've done a bad thing and we are being held accountable for it, the punishment itself is being sent to prison. The punishment is
Mhm.
not being left to die in prison. Our family and friends, in my opinion, should not have to wonder if we are safe, or if we're getting fed, if we're getting medical care, if we're getting outside. During COVID, there are jails and prisons that there was no rec time for years, for 2, 3 years, meaning people didn't go outside. They didn't see the sun for 2 or 3 years unless
Oh
they were
my
going to
goodness.
court. And even now, folks are just starting to, or not folks, prisons and jails are just starting to reinstitute rec time, recreation time.
Wow.
Hmm.
Because that in and itself, if someone, I can imagine, did not have any type of mental affliction, just being cooped up for years, no rec time, no way of releasing energy, that's enough to create a mental problem or a mental concern that may or may not have been there pre. I mean, that is awful. I did not know that.
Yeah, that's right. And then the other thing I think that's important to point out about our prisons and jails is that the jail structure system is really designed to hold people who are pretrial. So, as you mentioned before, these are people who have not yet been convicted of anything, they've simply been accused of something. And the purpose that jail serves is to ensure that people will respond to court when it's their time to go to court, and then people are also held there if the crime that they're accused of is one where a judge and prosecutors feel as though that person might be a danger to society while they're out. So it's essentially to keep people from fleeing and to keep society safe in certain cases. What we find though is that the bail and bond structure, which is the amount of money that you may have to pay to be released from jail if you're not in one of those categories. So initially, when you go to court, you're accused, you're indicted, and you have an opportunity to have a hearing for bail or bond. Um, and when, the judge can either grant that or deny it. And we're finding that when the judge grants that, sometimes they're granting such a high bond amount that people
Mhm.
aren't actually able to pay it. So when you hear folks talking about, we're locking poor people up essentially, and for no reason other than they're poor, that's what we're talking about, is this thing that, well, if they had resources, they could be out of jail. But because
Right.
they don't have resources, they're sitting in jail. And it's important also to note that, especially during COVID and post COVID, we're seeing people who are sitting in jail for 3 or 4 or 5 years without having had been convicted of anything. And so particularly where these are folks who are poor and can't afford bond or bail, or well, it's bail. Um, sorry, it's bond. Bail is when you actually pay it. Um,
Mhm.
and so, people are sitting in these jails that are very dangerous.
Yeah.
And they're not dangerous necessarily just because of the people that are in there. They're dangerous because they're incredibly understaffed.
Mhm.
There's not enough staff to go around, and that's in every aspect, whether we're talking about medical staff or we're talking about security staff. So Lashonda mentioned someone who it was reported that they were eaten alive by bed bugs and scabies. And
Mhm.
that's how this person died. And they
Mhm.
weren't found until a couple of days later. And that's because there's not staff to go around to do the checks, is what the sheriff's office is saying. Um,
Mhm.
and the fact that we have jails that are infested with bugs to the extent that somebody could be eaten alive and then not noticed
Yeah.
is, I mean, it's not even slave, like, it's worse than slavery, like, it's
Right.
not it's really unfathomable. And so
Right.
people are dying in our jails and prisons. They're dying because of, violence in some cases, and they're dying because of lack of access to medical care. And
Right.
it's, so when we have innocent people or potentially innocent people, or just poor people who are sitting there because they can't pay, that's a problem, and it frankly puts their life and their health, their well-being at risk. And we do see people who are leaving with severe mental health issues, PTSD, um, and other issues that are coming to light while they're there, um, and not receiving treatment.
Wow, that's a lot to unpack. I mean, we don't even have enough time to even go through that because we haven't even touched on. I know you mentioned the medication. A lot of the issues that I've been reading about have to do with individuals who have the need for mental health related medications that are not getting them and then penalized for behavior that results in them not from them not getting their medication.
Yeah,
And while they are in the care at the jail or the prison, they are in the care of the jail and the prison. So they're responsible for making sure that they get this stuff and then the medication and the health care they need. And it's just not happening. And it's just a cycle that keeps going, going, going. So, yeah, so we're going to have you come back to talk more about this because we don't even have enough time to talk about that.
yeah, yeah. But I guess
Yeah.
before we move off of this conversation, because I don't want to talk about this and then not give folks any ideas about what to do if this is happening to a loved one in their life.
Okay. Yeah. Let's
Um,
talk about that then.
Yeah, so folks can reach out to the county sheriff, if their loved one is in a jail facility, or the warden, if they're in a prison facility, um, and lodge your complaint, essentially. And it's really important. It is important that folks on the inside have support on the outside, because folks on the inside are advocating for themselves, but they have so little power, and it can just so easily be ignored. In all of these circumstances, there are grievance processes that folks use, when they're inside, and sometimes those grievances are just ignored, but they do need to utilize and exhaust the grievance procedure, which means file your grievance. If it's denied, you keep appealing it until you've reached the end of the line. And what that will do is preserve your right to sue, if you do have something that can be sued about. And then, as far as family on the outside, calling, sending letters, contacting your local elected officials about what's happening, with the caveat, though, and this is an important caveat, that retaliation does happen. Retaliation
Mhm.
happens in jails and prisons. So we like to tell people to make sure that your loved one wants you advocating for them, because in your advocacy, as well meaning as you are,
Mhm.
what you may be doing is putting a target on somebody's back who doesn't want that target, or who isn't really able to defend themselves, or who isn't comfortable being in that position. And sometimes, unfortunately, it really is a balancing act of, well, how bad is what I'm experiencing? How long is what I'm experiencing going to last? And is it worth, getting this potential target? And that's not to say that every time, it's not every time, but it is, I would be remiss to say to just ignore the existence of retaliation, because that is a thing.
Wow. That's heavy. That is real. That's some real a heavy burden to
Hmm.
carry on either side of it.
Hmm.
Either side of it. Oh my gosh. So, as far as filing a grievance, is there a website where people could go to get assistance or to figure out, okay, what is the process for filing the grievance, the timeline for filing a grievance? Where would someone go
Hmm.
to get that information?
Yeah, so if you're somebody that's on the inside, because only people that are incarcerated can file a grievance. So, like,
Okay,
I, as a family member or an attorney of somebody, I can't file an official grievance. I can send a letter that says, and this is often what I do in my role, is, send a letter to whoever the top official is within the institution and explain what's happened and ask for a specific outcome. But if you're on the inside, you should be given a handbook for the jail or the prison that you're at. Each jail, so jails are county run, which means that each jail has its own set of rules. If you're locked up in Fulton County Jail, they're going to have something different than if you're locked up in DeKalb County Jail, who's going to have something different than if you're locked up in Carroll County. So you'll want to make sure that you're going through that handbook to locate the grievance procedure there. As far as Georgia Department of Corrections, they run the prison system. Most of the prisons are through Georgia Department of Corrections, but there are a few that are private prisons. All of the Georgia Department of Correction prisons have the same grievance procedure, which is also going to be outlined in their handbook.
okay,
Um, I do believe, like, you can do an open records request, for, like, if you're a family member, for some of the policies. Not all of GDC's standard operating procedures, their SOPs, not all of them are, available to the public, and some of them are even considered contraband for incarcerated people. So don't send these standard operating procedures to incarcerated folks unless you know that that particular SOP is not considered contraband.
oh my gosh, yet another hurdle. Oh my
Hmm.
goodness. Okay.
Yeah, it's not great, and so that's, like I said, that's primarily what I do. In terms of the civil rights work that I do, is really helping to people to navigate advocacy when they're on the inside, and helping their family members.
Okay. So let's switch gears quickly before we switch gears for a third time. You also have an interest in educating companies and employees about their rights in the workplace,
That's right.
with regard to race relations, inclusion. Um, Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so my side hustle, I call it, is as an anti-racism and cultural humility consultant to primarily law firms. So what I'm doing when when I say that, we're most folks are familiar with the term DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. You all may have folks coming into your workplaces to do trainings on diversity, equity, and inclusion, or you may have an internal, like, diversity manager or diversity coordinator or something of that effect. So I work within that line of work to go into companies and help these companies learn about what true inclusion and true equity means. And the approach that I take is really coming from systems thinking, which is really considering how everything that's happening around us is working in coordination to exclude folks of color in particular. But also, this is true for LGBTQ folks, and people that do not speak English as their first language, immigrants, and people with disabilities. And so what I do is talk about really the history of race and racism and xenophobia and homophobia in the United States, back to colonialism. And then we tie in kind of our founding values here in the United States to what we're experiencing today. And this is like when folks hear people talk about white supremacy culture or white dominant culture, this is what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about like white supremacy as in the KKK or some extremist group or a specific person who is being actively and in your face racist. What I'm talking about, what we talk about, is the values that we've grown up with in our country that center whiteness, that center, the white culture and white as being powerful, and that harm folks of color in order to
Mhm.
subjugate folks of color. And there's, many systems in place, the criminal legal system being one of those things, a direct offshoot of slavery. And, we see that the criminal legal system disproportionately impacts communities of color. Um, we say that the criminal legal system is working exactly how it was intended to.
Wow. Wow, a lot to unpack there. I'm telling you, you have a lot of layers there. So we need to have another session about that. Now, on another note, switching gears, not again, we want to congratulate you on recently launching your podcast, Impostrix Podcast.
That's right.
Tell us a little bit about your podcast.
Yeah. So Impostrix Podcast is a show that affirms professionals of color who navigate imposter syndrome and racial toxicity at work. So I'm really talking about the intersectionality of imposter syndrome or imposter phenomenon, which is this feeling that we are not adequate intellectually, or that we're intellectual frauds, or that, we're really not as smart as other people think we are,
Mhm.
and this fear that we're going to be found out. So that's imposter phenomenon. And then race. And I feel like this is important because I'm 10 years into my career now as an attorney, and I definitely still experience imposter syndrome
Mhm.
in during the course of my workday. But I think that as a Black woman,
Mhm.
I'm also experiencing is uh, the remnants of exclusionary practices within the legal profession.
Mhm.
Um, And I don't even know if they're remnants. I really do think that there's still, it's there's less folks of color who's practice law. We are definitely a minority in this profession. And what that means is that how I am seen, how I'm addressed when I work, like if I'm going into a courtroom, how somebody might talk to me is going to be different than how somebody might talk to a white male.
Mhm.
How I dress when I go into a courtroom. What I perceive is that I need to look my best so that people will recognize me as a professional and not as an accused person who is
Yeah.
there for their trial, or as a secretary. Um, Not that there's anything wrong with secretaries,
Right.
but we are very much, it's a surprise to folks that
Yeah.
there are Black women attorneys. And so the podcast, it talks about how, and what the compounding effects of having an internalized feeling of being an imposter, how that layers on top of having an external feeling of being an imposter because of my race. And so I recently read a book called I'm Not Yelling, by Elizabeth Leiba, and it's about Black women in career and how we show up in the workplace and the various things that we're up against, whether that's being stereotyped as an angry Black woman or our tone being policed. Because if we talk too loud, then all of a sudden
Mhm.
we're being aggressive and angry. Um, and I really think that while everybody can experience imposter syndrome, and in fact, up to 80% of people, of high achievers, experience imposter syndrome, I think that as a woman of color, I experience it differently than a white person may experience it.
Mhm.
So that's what the
Wow.
podcast is about. And I'm super excited about the podcast because the other thing is that this isn't unique. What I experience is not unique.
Right.
And I think that the more that we talk about how we're feeling in our careers,
Yeah.
the more that we'll be able to heal from racial
Mhm.
traumas that are happening, whether or not the racial trauma is career related. Um, and, really root ourselves in our power as
Mhm.
professionals of color. We are operating right now in systems that were not intended for us, is my belief.
Right.
And, I think we need to open our eyes to that, and not only us as folks of color, but white folks that we work with who want to be allies or who want to be with us in solidarity. We need, I think white folks also need a space to be able to hear from folks of color, like what
Mhm.
this experience is. What are we actually even talking about here when we say things like diversity and inclusion and belonging? Like, I don't understand what you mean because I invited you to lunch.
Right.
So this podcast, it gives folks of color the opportunity to support each other, to learn from each other, to get tools around how we can navigate this intersectionality, to get validation and affirmation around the fact that what we're experiencing is real. We're not making it up. We're going to resist gaslighting is what I like to say, because
Mhm.
oftentimes if we bring something up to somebody that we're working with and they may say that we're being overly sensitive or try and explain it away, that's gaslighting. Nah,
Yeah.
you experienced what you experienced, like that was real, that happened.
Right.
And so I want to provide a space for folks to feel validated. But I also want to provide a space where we can learn about the history of race and the history of racial capitalism, and how racial trauma affects our brains and affects our minds and affects how we show up to work. Because I think all of this information is power, you know
Right.
so yeah, that's what we're gonna be doing, and then, it's a place for white folks. I like to say it's a place for white folks to eavesdrop
Yeah.
and learn without feeling the fear or the discomfort, um, that, sometimes can block
Oh, yeah.
cross-racial discussion,
Sure.
because there's so much, race is such a packed thing in our country, and particularly in our workplaces.
Whitney, can you believe our time is up? I cannot believe it. I was sitting on the edge of my
How?
seat the entire conversation. So, one, I want to thank you for sharing your knowledge, and we have to have you back because, as you can see, we only put a little drop of
Mhm.
the tip of the iceberg here.
Absolutely.
But for our listeners, for our viewers, how can they find you? How can they find the podcast? Let's make sure everybody can locate you. So tell us.
Yes, yes. Okay, so the podcast again, it's called Impostrix Podcast. Impostrix podcast. And there's a website, www.impostrixpodcast.com. I am also on social media, primarily on Instagram at Impostrix Podcast, and then on LinkedIn, where you can just search my name, Whitney Knox Lee. And then also, we launched in July. And so we've got some episodes. I invite folks to go listen to those episodes and become a part of this community, because I think it's really, I think it's a needed space,
Yes.
and I really hope that people can find support. Yeah.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you again for joining us. And as always, thank you everyone for listening, for watching. And it's definitely been a pleasure to have you here. And we got to have you back. We got to have
Yes,
you back.
absolutely. Absolutely.
All right, everyone. Until next time, you've been watching Life Lessons in Law with Lashonda. Take care. You've been tuning into Life Lessons in Law with Lashonda. In each episode, we have authentic and entertaining conversations about the impact of the law on women. I hope you'll join me each time. You can find this show on my website at www.thecounselfirm.com and on YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and more. We We appreciate your positive comments and reviews. And don't forget to share this show with others. I've been your host, Lashonda Council Rogers.